Hi, I'm Noah Weisberg.
And I'm Nick Esterbauer.
Welcome to Holland Estates. You're listening to episode number 574. How are you, Nick?
I'm doing well, thanks, Noah. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. Today, we thought we would talk about social media and the impact it is having, not only in litigation in general, but in estates litigation. Most of you are probably watching us now on social media, and more and more we see generations embracing social media, whether it be Facebook, Instagram, and more that is spilling over into the area that we practice. So I think there's two things that we want to talk about today. The first thing is, what are the responsibilities as a lawyer to advise our clients regarding social media? And the second thing is, what do clients need to think about when proceeding with a claim? So, Nick, first of all, why don't we talk about, as a lawyer, what kind of obligations we need to be telling our clients when it comes to preparing an affidavit of documents and disclosing relevant documents.
Right, so historically when we were talking about documents, really those were documents in writing. They were paper documents that were easy to identify, and it was relatively easy to figure out whether or not that might be something that's relevant to litigation. Now, in the last, 10 years really or so, we're seeing people having an online presence where they've got all this information that's online, it's on computers, it's electronic and not necessarily physical. And so we have to consider whether or not that qualifies as a document and whether clients have an obligation to preserve that evidence because it might be relevant to litigation and they might have an obligation to produce it.
Exactly. So it's all about advising the clients to preserve these documents and to consider producing it in the context of an affidavit of documents. So we at Holland Hall, when we do our reporting letters to clients, we always make sure to include that in there so clients are aware as to what those obligations are. So that's kind of the role of the lawyer. And now, what about social media evidence and how it's used in the context of estates litigation? So first and foremost, Nick, I read your blog the other week about the French Elvis. So why don't you briefly explain the role that social media played in that decision?
So in that decision, really the key to the outcome in the dispute was social media evidence, and specifically evidence on Instagram, which documented exactly where the French Elvis, is what he was known as. His name was Johnny Halliday, where he was living at each in the years preceding his death. So in France, there's forced heirship, and in the United States, there is not. So the French Elvis was moving back and forth between France and between the United States. And after he died, it was unclear where he was domiciled, where he'd been living, and whether or not he needed to leave a benefit for his adult children who made a claim against his estate. And ultimately, they were able to use evidence from Instagram to demonstrate that he'd been living, at least for enough of the time, in France, and that he had an obligation to benefit them after he died.
Yeah, and that's just one great example. There's so many estate claims that we deal with. Domicile is an issue, and that's just a perfect an example of what social media can do in establishing domicile. And now, we also think about dependent support claims. So, what's the role of Instagram and Facebook of showing lifestyles that people live? I've got friends who love to post about where they go and what they do, and that, in my view, is so helpful in demonstrating if a person is a dependent, the lifestyle that they were living while someone was alive.
Totally, and I think one thing we might need to watch out for in the future is, a lot of people like to post sort of their best life on social media. Yeah. So whether or not what they're posting online is consistent with the lifestyle they're enjoying, but I think dependent support claims are the perfect example of where social media evidence may become more and more important.
Yeah, and now obviously we're not going to have time to get in today about how that evidence is produced, and I know that there's been some decisions as to whether evidence that's on a Facebook public profile versus a private profile is less and more admissible. But what we wanted to do today is just really summarily talk about what our lawyers should be doing when advising their clients, and for clients to think about the type of evidence which they can use in substantiating their claims. So I think that concludes our podcast for today. Until next time, we want to thank you for listening. I'm Noah Weisberg.
And I'm Nick Esterbauer.
Should you have any questions, please email us at webmaster@hollandhall.com or leave a comment on our blog. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Noah.